The new Fed chair nominee, Kevin Warsh. There's a new Trump nominee for Fed chair to replace Jerome Powell, former Fed governor and investment banker Kevin Warsh. Given his hawkish background, there is already speculation as to how he will mesh with President Trump and his urgent desire for lower interest rates. We'll talk more about that next week. But today, before we talk about who might run the Fed, we need to talk about what the Fed actually is, and more importantly, what it was originally built to do. Hi, I'm Richard Vague with Tycos. To understand the Federal Reserve, we need to go back a lot further than Washington, D.C., all the way back to 1401 in Barcelona to an institution called the Taula de Candy, then to Genoa in 1407 with the Casa di San Giorgio, and famously to London in 1694, where something world-changing was created, the Bank of England, the true beginning of the modern era of banking. These early central banks weren't built to fine-tune inflation or manage employment. Their jobs were much simpler: lend to governments, especially for war, also standardized currency, and help merchants settle payments. But everything changed in the 1800s. The industrial age exploded onto the scene. Canals, factories, railroads. And with it came something new and terrifying: modern financial panics. England learned this lesson the hard way. It had major banking crises in 1825, the late 1830s, 1847, 1857, and 1866. And each followed the same grim script. Banks overloaned, overcapacity built up, loans went bad, markets collapsed, banks collapsed, and the economy cratered. When panic hit, the Bank of England would flood the system with liquidity, gold, deposits, emergency loans, just enough to keep banks alive and the economy functioning. This was a new role for a new bank-filled age, and it was made famous by the economist editor Walter Bagehot, who popularized that role as being, quote, the lender of last resort, or LOLR. You'll see that acronym. But let's cross over the Atlantic Ocean and look at the American story. The U.S. did not even have a central bank after 1836. So when its crises hit in 1837, 1857, 1873, 1884, 1893, and 1907, there was no official backstop, nor even the idea that there should be. Then something uncomfortable happened. In 1893 and again in 1907, it fell to J.P. Morgan, a private banker, and his institution to personally organize rescues of the American financial system. One man, one bank, saving the country. It worked, but it was mortifying. After that, government and business leaders came to the conclusion, incorrectly but resolutely, that it was the presence of the Bank of England itself that had resulted in England having so many fewer crises than the U.S. after 1866. So a group of politicians and financiers quietly sailed to Europe to study how central banks worked. They came back convinced the U.S. needed one too. That eventually produced the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, and just like that, the Federal Reserve was born. While today you may know that the Fed is charged with a dual mandate of controlling inflation and maximizing employment, neither of these two things was its primary purpose at its birth. The Fed's original mission was much narrower: be the lender of last resort, prevent financial panics, issue currency, supervise banks, and keep the payment system working. To do this, it was given just three powers, in essence: set interest rates, conduct open market operations, buying securities and loans in the open market, and supervise banks. That's it. No mention of inflation or unemployment. And ironically, when the Fed was most needed for this original purpose, after the stock market crash of 1929, It failed to fully act as that lender of last resort, instead taking a wrong-headed cue from Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon and standing aside as banks failed, believing, as he reportedly said, that it would, quote, purge the rottenness out of the system, end quote. That failure was a major reason the Great Depression was so deep and devastating. Fast forward to the 1970s. Runaway inflation, driven largely by oil shocks and Middle East policy, devastated the economy. A furious Congress responded by imposing two new requirements on the Fed in 1977: control inflation and maximize employment. The famous dual mandate was born. But in doing so, the Fed slowly forgot the job it was originally created to do, so much so that in 2008, during the worst financial crises since the Great Depression, there was real debate over whether the Fed should rescue the system at all. Thankfully, it did. Which brings us to the question I want to leave you with. If the Fed, in essence, has only three tools, interest rates, open market operations, and bank supervision, can it truly exercise the level of control over inflation and employment that we assume it has? Economists talk about the Fed as if it's flying the economy with a joystick. Pull rates back a little, and growth rises. Push rates up a little, inflation falls. As a result, quarter-point rate changes are debated endlessly, as if they have immediate, precise, and mechanical effects. But do they? In a world shaped by innovation, demographics, competition, trade, tariffs, corporate behavior, consumer psychology, and geopolitics, does moving interest rates 0.25% really work like an airplane control stick? Or are we expecting far more causality and precision than the Fed system can possibly deliver? Next week, we'll talk about Kevin Walsh and what kind of Fed chair this moment might produce. That's it for this week. Thanks.